Hello, and thanks for tuning in to s.a.m at PAM, where science and art meet at the Portland Art Museum. I'm Karen Bishop, and I'm a graduate conservation intern here at the museum.
And I'm Ben Cort. I'm the collections and exhibitions photographer here at PAM.
And in this episode of s.a.m at PAM, we're going to share a little bit about the conservation treatment and photography of Constantine Brancusi's Muse. Conservation encompasses a variety of actions taken towards the long-term preservation of cultural property, whether that be artworks or works of historical objects. So I'm interning this summer at the Portland Art Museum as part of my master's program, which is the art conservation at SUNY Buffalo State in New York. And my main project this summer has been the conservation treatment of Muse, which is a highly polished bronze bust by Constantine Brancusi. And the smooth and reflective surface had become marred by corrosion and fingerprints, so it came into the conservation lab. The sculpture has been in the museum's collection since 1959, and it was a gift from Miss Sally Lewis, who is credited as an early collector of modern art and was credited with bringing contemporary art to the West Coast. I'll just bring up a photo here. In the form and in the surface treatment. So in order to achieve this really high gloss, Brancusi was known to polish his works by hand over long periods of time, almost obsessively. So this really makes the surface of the sculpture just as important as the form. And so, as you can see, the actual work is behind us here. And it has just received conservation treatment in the lab, and we're about to set up for photography today. So as I mentioned before, the surface of the sculpture is really important, and it also makes it really hard to photograph because of its reflective style. So that's why I worked with Ben taking conservation photographs for Muse, as this is a really important part of conservation to capture how the piece looks both before, during, and after treatment.
Yeah, so at the museum, I'm responsible for taking photographs of all the art of a collection of loan objects, and a big part of what I have to do here is work with conservation, with Karen and with Samantha, to capture before treatment photography. So basically images of the state of the object before they modify it. One of the other things that I do is sort of general collection shots and also sort of what we call beauty shots. So this is an example of a shot. Stories of hiring photographers that put powdering agents on the sculptures to dull them down, make them less reflective, and then him firing them because he was all about the sort of the surface finish that Karen's been working so hard to bring out and restore.
So as Ben mentioned earlier, the before treatment photographs really show the issues here with the you have to go beyond cleaning, and so that's why polishing was necessary. But before starting any kind of treatment, it's really important to get to know as much about the artist and his working methods and the piece itself as possible. So before the piece came off view, and this also to kind of avoid having it come off view for very long, since it is such a popular sculpture, I did a in-gallery kind of quick once-over look at it, and then did research on how Brancusi's had been treated by other conservators at other institutions, because this kind of shiny reflective surface is such a well-known feature of his. And so once the piece did come off display, we did some analytical work as well. So in order to look at it a little more closely, I used a stereo microscope just to really see what was going on with the surface of the piece. And with that, I could really see that the fingerprints and some of the uneven cleaning had actually really etched into the surface. And also while doing some research on the piece, there was recording of a very similar Muse that's actually in the collection of the Museum of Fine Art Houston, that it was gilded at one point in the hair, which is kind of interesting. So I thought, well, maybe there could be some gilding in this piece as well. And looking at it under the microscope, and here I have a photomacrograph to So what gilding is something can either be amalgam gilded, which is a mercury process, which we determined this piece wasn't, or it's applied in what's known as gold leaf, which is really thin sheets of gold that are then applied to the surface of the piece. And so that's what we're most likely seeing here, is like basically little flakes of gold. But again, this could have possibly been maybe just a bronze paint that was applied to look like gold. And so luckily, Dr. Tammy Clare from Portland State University was already coming over to the lab to work on another project looking at the colorants in Japanese prints. And so while she was here, we were able to also use X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, which is a non-destructive analytical method for basically looking at the elemental composition of a sculpture. And what I mean by non-destructive is that we don't have to like take a physical sample and away from the object in order to see what it's made of. We're just able to set up a mobile unit, which I will pull up a photo of here. So this was really important, not only for art historical reasons to know that there was gilding, because this kind of shows that it was during a more experimental time of Brancusi's, because he was known to eventually abandon gilding later on when he wasn't very happy with how it turned out in the end. But also as a conservator and for a piece that's about to undergo treatment, it's important to know that gilding is there because it's a really fine surface feature that could easily be scratched or removed with any kind of mechanical action. And so by looking at it under the microscope and researching Brancusi's working methods and talking with other professionals who had worked on pieces like this before, we were able to kind of formulate a conservation treatment plan. So all this kind of comes together with the photography, kind of knowing that we have evidence of what it looked like before. And then we can kind of start in on the polishing aspect, which is what we deemed necessary to return the surface of the piece from kind of this marred and mottled surface to a more uniform surface. And so by knowing all this information, I chose a few different polishing compounds, and basically what these are is really fine abrasive. Like if you were to touch it with your skin, it wouldn't feel like what you'd think of as like a rough sandpaper or something like that. And then specially mixed with different solvents to act as kind of make it a slurry, almost to the consistency of toothpaste. And so I started by kind of testing these different polishing compounds on other pieces of brass that weren't art objects, just to kind of get a feel for it and see what their action was, like meaning how quickly it kind of ate away at the surface or was able to move tarnish and that kind of thing. And so once I was happy that I had found something that was going to be mild enough to use on the sculpture, then I could kind of test small areas, discrete areas in the back to see how it actually acted on the piece of art itself. So this is a really long process to kind of find the right material. And in the end, I chose a polishing compound that worked for the overall smooth surface of the piece and just kind of slowly worked my way around. Because the goal is to have it uniform, but I don't want to clean or polish one area so much that then as I move to the front, that area can't actually get that polish, and then you kind of end up with this mottled surface again. So really the polishing and cleaning and all that kind of thing is really kind of a give and take and a gradual process that that you go over the whole piece. And so now that the polishing has taken place, it definitely will make the after treatment photography that much more of a challenge.
Yeah, and not to say the early photography wasn't a challenge to begin with, but so much like Karen did research and reached out with scholars and people who are knowledgeable about the Brancusi process, I wound up reaching out to people who are knowledgeable in photographing them. Two places that were good resources for this were the Houston Fine Art Museum. They have a similar piece to ours. So looking at their collection image and looking at how they're working through it and sort of looking at their lighting styling, looking at what their final image looked like was pretty helpful. And then I was able actually to have a conversation with the photography team at MoMA. They're some of the more recent, this is sort of the recent piece that's been photographed. And I was able to have a really nice conversation with a couple of the photographers there who talked about the compositing techniques they used and sort of building the surface with the curatorial team to sort of get the right look. Because that's the thing you find with photographing reflective pieces is that the way the eye interprets them is through the world around them. And that's sort of what Brancusi wanted when he photographed stuff. He wanted to show the world of the gallery in the piece. And since I'm not Brancusi trying to photograph them, it's important to sort of try and keep it as objective as possible and really highlight the surface concerns, particularly in conservation imaging. So to do this, we ended up getting pretty crazy. One of the things that's tricky about photographing reflective pieces is they're reflective. They pick up everything around them. So to photograph the Brancusi, you can see a little sliver of it right here.
Sorry, I just need to step in because we are getting a little bit of, we're losing our feed for the computer. That's all. So I just want to make sure that this is going okay.
Dang it, computer.
So thank you all for your patience.
This is John, our wonderful live stream guru here, jumping in, saving the day.
Good, it's working now.
Stream here, but it's a pretty flat plane. This is where the camera's poking through to capture the image. MoMA for taking the time to help me out with some of that stuff. That was really helpful, particularly for branching out and making sure that we were sort of in keeping with the standards on the photography side as well as the conservation side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was really helpful for me too, to be able to reach out to conservators at other institutions who had worked on, if not similar pieces, to at least kind of similar in style as far as wanting to be minimally invasive, but at the same time having to actually change the surface of the piece just physically by the act of polishing. And so it's been mentioned before with conservation photography, the piece might not look like the beauty shot, but that's not what we want, because with the piece before, it was pretty mottled overall. It had a much more golden appearance to the surface, and this was just due to the oxidized brass is what the sculpture is actually made from technically, but is referred to as bronze since it is an art piece. And this just means that it's copper with zinc and lesser amounts of tin, just to get technical there. So anyways, the bronze piece had a bit more of a golden hue to it, and this was due to the oxidized surface. So as soon as polishing began, this very thin surface layer is taken away, and we're kind of left with more of like a silvery, almost kind of a rose gold pinkish hue. So for those of you who are maybe familiar with the piece on display for the past couple decades, it will probably look pretty different at first because of the fact that the overall color and hue has changed for this freshly polished surface. So because it is freshly polished, this means that any of the oxidized metal has essentially been removed, and oxidation is a natural process with any kind of metal other than noble metals such as gold, where the very surface of the metal is interacting with oxygen and just the general environment. So a lot of people are probably familiar with this as far as like tarnish on silver pieces and that kind of thing. So again, back to the actual conservation treatment of polishing, this is pretty akin to how you would polish silver as well, where you are, by polishing, technically removing material, but trying to do as little of that as possible. And since it has been polished now and has this really freshly polished appearance, the question is ultimately, what was Brancusi going for as far as an overall surface appearance? We absolutely know that he wanted it to be uniform and to have this kind of luster, because he was even known to instruct his collectors to like daily take a chamois cloth and give it a polish to take off any kind of oxides or pollution. But as far as the overall color of the piece, or what you might even refer to as patina, is kind of hard to know exactly, because even if we did have original color photographs, as have mentioned earlier, it's all kind of subjective due to lighting and what kind of instrument you are capturing the photograph with. And so that's something that within the conservation photography, we try and keep as standardized as possible. So we'll be using we'll use the same lights, the same camera, everything will be set the same distance, and that way we can really show the before and after of not only the surface change, but the really subtle color variations as well.
And just to speak to a little bit of that sort of variation, I've got up on the screen
Yeah, because another area of question is the hair on a Muse, and I'll actually bring up if you want to pull up maybe the shot of the back there. Or exactly what he did after the piece was cast. And then again, because of the gilding, if anything were to happen, if anything were to be done to the corrosion product in the hair, it would have to be done essentially under a microscope just to be really careful of that really delicate gilded surface. And during the analytical phase 2, I did microchemical tests of the green and white products in the hair. And what microchemical tests are, as opposed to XRF, they are technically destructive because you do remove a sample from the piece. So basically what I did is take a teeny tiny sample, just using a little skewer to remove a little bit of that green and white product, and then was able to perform microchemical tests just using different solvents and methods for concluding whether something is or is not present. And so just for example, I was testing for chlorides just to see if chlorides were present, because this could be indicative of a type of corrosion that is much more destructive, otherwise known as bronze disease, which luckily it tested negative for. And so this basically tells us that this green and white product that we're seeing is stable. And so chlorides are often found in pieces that have been, actually a lot of times it's well known in burial objects, because this can happen through contamination of things that have had like contact with groundwater, and then also like pieces that have been stored outside, or even in a museum environment where something may have off-gassed and come in contact with the surface. So luckily it appears that whatever's going on with the hair, it is stable. So we will be leaving that be for now. And another aspect with the photography is, as you may have noticed earlier in the before treatment shot, that there's this
gone. Where to go?
yeah, where is it? Natural materials such as wood or stone, and kind of utilizing them for the natural elements. But if there was something that he was not okay with, such as a nick here or like a colored there, he would kind of fill it in. So doing research on this piece, we're pretty sure this was a later addition, since it is sandstone. It's pretty, it can be nicked easily. that at some point it probably got a little gouge in it. Someone filled it in and attempted to put some dots on it to kind of make it appear like the rest of it, but over time they started appearing differently. But again, not knowing for sure that this absolutely was applied by somebody else, we didn't want to remove it. So essentially applied a barrier layer to what was there and then painted over that. And so what that means is that the paint can later be removed in the future if deemed necessary. And what that did was just kind of using similar colors with the stone just to kind of tone it back and make it blend in. So when you're looking at the front of the sculpture, this isn't just kind of screaming out at you as something that's different.
And just sort of to highlight Karen's, she keeps mentioning, like, we don't know what an original looked like. We don't know what, these photos on the screen. The degree of helpfulness may or may not be there.
Yeah, so clearly from these photographs, we are unfortunately not able to judge the ideal color.
Or the sandstone dot that may or may not be there.
Exactly. So yeah, as been mentioned, those were accession photographs from 1959 because that's when the piece officially came to the museum, but it actually spent a lot of time here before that because it was a gift from Miss Sally Lewis, but she had actually purchased it in the 20s from a gallery in New York and had proudly displayed it in her home for a long time. It was one of her favorite pieces as well, but she very kindly would often lend it to the museum as kind of an educational experience so people could come and see it publicly until eventually gifting it in 1959. So even before then, it actually had some history here with the museum, which I found was pretty interesting. And so because the conservation treatment is kind of wrapping up, it luckily will be going back on display soon. We have a little more stabilization to do with the base just because so that essentially it fits in with two long pins that sit into the stone. But the holes are a little too big, so there's some room for it to kind of shift around. So just to be as safe and secure as possible, kind of developing a method so that it sits securely. So that'll take just a little bit longer, but then it will be going back on display early next week. And if you'd like to know more information about it in the meantime, and so for the to kind of elaborate a little bit more on the pins. So because the holes are a little too large in the sandstone block itself, but the pins, are part of the sculpture as well. What I'll probably end up doing is making essentially a collar for the pins, and that way they fit in there a little more snug, so that kind of rocking back and forth action will be hopefully taken care of. Yeah, like I said, so that should be back on display early next week. And in the meantime, there's a label in the gallery in the vitrine that it sits on, kind of briefly describing the things that we talked about today. And then it also will point you to a blog that I wrote about this piece, just in case you're tuned in a little bit later and missed something that kind of has some details as well. And then there's other s.a.m. at PAM blogs that you can check out if you're curious about other conservation efforts that have been going on here in the museum. And also, if you'd like to click the link in the description, that'll take you to our online collections. That'll tell you a little bit more about this piece as well. Yeah, so I guess if we don't have any questions, I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning in today, and be sure to check out more episodes of s.a.m. at PAM.
Thanks for watching.